All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, the most important debate that should be happening in our country right now is not happening. It's not a surprise to me, but it's one of the profound injustices that comes at a real turning point in our country. I'm not talking about Trump. I'm not talking about Joe Biden. I'm talking, as usual, a bipartisan failure of the highest order that has put a gun to the head of American citizens that guarantees they will take a bullet either way and which will take many decades to recover from. From nearly the day that this pandemic began, a debate has raged in this country about government-mandated restrictions. Should the government be able to close businesses and tell people to stay home? At what point can we sacrifice liberty? And how do we as a society balance the certainty of people getting sick with resulting economic shutdowns? Now, I can't answer any of the questions about civil liberties, but I can answer the latter. If you accept that lockdowns and restrictions on businesses must be a part of life and mandated by the government, then you have no choice but to remunerate those businesses for staying closed and remunerate the workers who lost income as a result of this closure. It's the most obvious solution in the world. And yet, what did Congress do? Well, in March, they passed the CARES Act, which beefed up the unemployment system, and it passed some aid to the Paycheck Protection Program for small businesses. That worked for a time. It even dropped poverty for many workers. But we know now the devastating results. Many millions of people are now permanently unemployed because the aid we extended to businesses ran out and they ended up failing. And worse, Washington decided not to renew the unemployment benefits that expired many months ago, meaning that we got the worst of all worlds. We locked down, then we didn't have bailout businesses, then we let aid to workers expire, and it's not like they have another job to go back to, do they? We now have an environment where people look suspiciously at any calls for lockdown because they know they're essentially being left out in the cold. How did this madness happen? Well, it happened because bad faith actors in the Republican Party, and libertarians especially, never wanted to lock down or have social distancing. So they lobbied as hard as they could against any additional stimulus and unemployment insurance. Then, whenever President Trump woke up near the end of 2020 campaign, realized we desperately indeed did need stimulus, Nancy Pelosi decided to hold up his attempts because she didn't want to make sure he won re-election. Their partisanship, incompetence, and idiocy has now placed us where we are today, in an even worse situation. Because as I sit here, coronavirus cases across the interior of the country are exploding with 166,581 cases yesterday and 796 deaths. Mayors, governors, and local officials now face a terrible choice. Many officials are going the route of putting in stricter measures. California has once again restricted indoor dining. Major American cities, Philadelphia, Kansas City, Chicago, states like New Mexico, Washington, Iowa. I expect only to see this list of places grow, and it makes me so angry. Why? Because I know with relative certainty this decision guarantees the death of tens of thousands of small businesses which managed to hang on to this point. In effect, every governor and mayor across the country now has to decide whether they risk letting the virus ravage their cities or choose the death of their businesses. It never had to be this way. They could have passed more stimulus several times over. They could have at least put politics aside for a brief moment in the lead up to the election and pass at least some stimulus for small businesses. But they didn't. And you could say, yeah, Saagar, but maybe they'll wake up and face the facts. I wish I shared your optimism. And just to pour cold water on it, here's a quote from Senator Richard Shelby yesterday, who would literally write such a bill if it were to exist on whether COVID-19 will end up passing soon. Quote, I think right now Democrats would have to come a long way back to reality with us to get a bill. So there you go. Nothing has changed, and per Politico's Jake Sherman yesterday, there has not been a single discussion on Capitol Hill about COVID relief since they got back. For all intents and purposes, it is likely dead. It's a crime, and it's now the reality that we face. That reality is a barren landscape and arguably one of the worst economic winters for this country since 1932. And honestly, I hate myself for it, but I've got to sit here and argue at this point that this set of political conditions, I do not think it is tenable for this country to have widespread lockdown once again. I think on the merits, it is and always has been the correct thing to do in the scientific abstract. But in an environment where Nancy Pelosi won't budge on stimulus, where Mitch McConnell is not passing anything through the Senate, and where Trump is largely uninterested in governing, then this is an operational environment which we must make decisions. You either have to accept more restrictions or choose mass unemployment. And at this point, several months into the pandemic, we already know a few things. As of last month, 100,000 restaurants have closed due to coronavirus. Roughly works out to 1 in 6. We already expected some more of these to close as outdoor dining wanes across the East Coast. But with new restrictions on indoor dining in many of these places that are already cold, that's it. It's pretty much over. That means more permanent job loss, and worse, it means even more places that will die, which the underemployed and those in the service industry will not be able to return to after we have a widespread vaccine. Furthermore, socially, at this point, there is no trust. Americans did their patriotic duty. They stayed home, and their government was supposed to save them, but they didn't. Essentially, they paid them off for a little while, but mostly left them to rot. And it looks like, once again, we may enter that scenario. And I have no choice but to at least say here that I think it's crazy after several months in which citizens have been abandoned to expect them to coop themselves up once again with no pay. It never should have been this way. It's one of the worst government failures since Herbert Hoover's response to the Great Depression in 1932. And it's bipartisan, and it's one that will take us decades to recover from by accelerating the class divide that already separates Americans today. And I wish I could tell you the right way to direct your anger, but I can't, because it's just going to be a bad winter. And the way I look at it, Crystal, is that it is just a complete holistic failure of government across all levels. And like I said, I don't want to sit here and argue, but these are the conditions that we face. Pelosi's not going to change anything. She sent Mitch McConnell a letter late yesterday being like, let's negotiate or something. McConnell's position is $500 billion. They won't pass that. And by the way, that $500 billion doesn't include stimulus checks. So there you go, right? In terms of what's coming to you, and it doesn't increase unemployment either. So in terms of to the average person, not going to do anything.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, look, $500 billion in aid to businesses, I'm all for it, but it's not nearly enough. And the way I think about it, 100,000 small businesses already closed. That's 1 in 6. If they close indoor dining, like Philadelphia closed indoor dining, the average temperature in Philly right now is like 40-something degrees. Like,
yeah,
what are you going to do? Go out and see? I went walking around in my neighborhood yesterday. There's a lot of restaurants that have outdoor seating. Even with the heat lamps, it's like 3 people out there.
Yeah.
How long are these people going to survive?
I know.
Like,
I mean, there's a reason why at the very beginning of this, with the very first stimulus, why people like you and I had our hair on fire about you have to do this in a way that continues throughout the length of the pandemic.
Yeah.
You have to just backstop people's payroll so that like none of this was necessary. You have to protect people so that they will and they can stay home because people got to go out and do what they got to do to feed their kids. Like that's just the reality of the situation. And we said from the very beginning that a lot of people want to create this false choice where it's either you lose your health or put your health at risk or you lose your livelihood.
Which is now where we are.
And that is exactly where we are now. And it did not have to be that way. I mean, you wonder why we were running around with our hair on fire again when you had a glimmer of a possibility of another stimulus before the election because we knew that would be the last possible chance. That was it. And so now, the government has no authority at this point to tell people what to do because they failed.
It's lawlessness, actually.
They failed in their end of the bargain. Their end of the bargain was you stay home and protect the public health, and we're going to make sure that you don't get kicked out of your houses, that you can pay your bills, that you can get back to your job when this is all over. That ship has sailed. That is gone and isn't coming back. And you can see there's zero negotiations going on right now in Capitol Hill. Stock market's hitting all-time high. So what do they care? That's the situation that we find ourselves in. And it absolutely outrages me because what's the backdrop? I just was reading this morning. Coronavirus cases are going up in every single state in the country right now. Okay, yesterday's numbers is from the New York Times, about 160,000 new cases and more than 1,500 new deaths. The number of deaths is ticking up day after day after day. Like, we're in a horrible situation with the pandemic, and yet I think that the most responsible thing, given the government failures at this point, is look, say, here's what the public health officials recommend. Here's what's safe. And now people have to figure it out for themselves because the government isn't doing anything to protect you and make sure that your livelihood will be there when this is all over, and I'm disgusted by it.
That's the key, right? Which is that it didn't have to be this way. Do you really think there would have been all this social unrest and all that if people had been paid? Like, no, I just do not believe that. Look at Britain and Germany and elsewhere. Are there lockdown protests? Yeah, a little bit. But in general, their payroll is covered. In Germany, same thing. They have a 4% unemployment rate in Germany. Same across much of Europe. Is there social consternation at being cooped up? Yes. Is it even close to what we see here in the United States? No. And that's reason why is purely the economic program. And they're not, look, essentially it's a free fall. And now it's turned even more into a culture war, right? So you got the blue cities and everybody else who wants to virtue signal, so they're just going to lock down. And it's like, okay, well, you're basically murdering your entire small business stock at this point. When you kill indoor dining, let's say that this spike, so quote unquote, lasts for 2 months. That's it. It's dead. I mean, many of these businesses were already operating on a 40% capacity. Most restaurants in the country can barely operate at 100% capacity.
Yeah.
So then 100,000 already failed. You're going to have maybe even more. No stimulus. And let's say stimulus does pass 3 weeks, 4 weeks. It's over. That's how quickly this is an exponential thing, right? So at that point, they'll have already failed. That's 4 weeks of lost income. It has huge downstream effects on so many people. Also, in December, the unemployment benefits, the extensions, those all expire. So what's going to happen? If you're a gig worker out there, and now there are a lot more gig workers because of the economy, they do not qualify for unemployment. So again, what are you going to do? And there's nothing going on right now. I bet you they let it expire. I bet you they do. Or maybe they'll pass it on in the government shutdown negotiations. Maybe.
The eviction moratorium also ends.
There you go.
There's been deferral of student loan payments. That also ends. I mean, these things have real dire impacts on household budgets and people's ability just to persist and to survive. And the thing that kills me, too, I mean, I think I'm more sympathetic maybe to the state and local leaders who are looking at these numbers and trying to figure out what to do. It's not their fault that D.C. ultimately failed them. And they don't have the power or ability to provide people with stimulus. So they're in an absolutely horrible situation of trying to balance, like, the small business situation, the worker problem, and then bodies piling up in morgues as they watch coronavirus ravage their communities. So I'm sympathetic to the impossible bind that they've been put in here as well. But the thing that kills me, too, is the end is in sight on this thing. I mean, we're getting news every day about vaccines that are really close to being officially sanctioned and able to be delivered. We're talking a few months when the most vulnerable people could start getting those vaccinations is what it looks like right now. Like, if they could just get it together to give a little bit of steam for a few more months, it would make all the difference. But they're not going to do it. They're not even talking about doing it. It's so far from happening that it's not even worth discussing.
Yeah, exactly. And look, we'll cover the negotiations, but we've covered a lot of negotiations. How many negotiations have you heard us cover over the last 8 months? And how many of those actually turned out to work out? So that's the depressing part. And look, it's a terrible choice. It's a terrible, terrible choice that they presented to us. And I don't think any of us should forget how this was handled by any of the people involved.
I wish that for once our cynicism would not end up being correct. I would love one time to come on and be like, you know what?
Yeah.
We were wrong.
They passed it.
They passed it. Oh, what the heck? Like, I thought that they were going to completely fail and fall on their face like they always do. So far, unfortunately, the cynical take has always been the correct one.
That's right. All right, I'm looking forward to your radar next, Crystal.